When I first started talking about lay farming, I had someone ask me, so is that like raising those flowers that the Hawaiian girls put in their necklaces? It's not that. So what is it? Well, okay. Let's start out here. What does soil provide for the plant? I can hear the crickets chirping. Come on, two things. What does soil provide for the plant? Okay, anchor the roots. Okay, but growth factors. Water and nutrients, right? Okay? That's pretty simple. We all know that for a long time. You didn't have to come here to learn that, right? Okay, so what I have here are two corn plants. And obviously one is little and one is big. These are the exact same hybrid, planted within minutes of each other from about 10 feet apart in the field. Full irrigation, full fertilization. Why is one 2 foot taller and about 4 times the biomass of the other, when the grower of both of these plants, same grower, provided all the water and all the fertilizer in excess? Turns out the one to the right, he just put in a center pivot and converted from flood irrigation to center pivot, and that allowed him to get the pivot to make a full swing. He took out this little 2-acre patch of native grass, and that is where the big corn plant came from. And you could see that difference from about a quarter mile down the road, this little patch out in the field. So, if the purpose of soil is to provide water and nutrients to the plant, and those are the only purposes, why is that plant twice as big? Apparently, there is something going on in a perennial sod, in that native grass, that we have not yet learned with our modern science, not yet learned how to duplicate. So, how do we get that back? How do we make the field where the little corn plant was growing grow plants like the big corn plant? Well, one way to do it is we can plant a diverse native prairie and wait 10,000 years. Come back and start farming later. Because that's about how old the prairie was once the glaciers receded from my area. Or can we do something a little shorter in duration? Because I don't know about you, but I'm not very patient. I don't plan on living another 10,000 years to reap those benefits. So the concept behind lay farming is to insert a perennial sod into the crop rotation for a short period of time. These are not intended to be forever mixtures. They're intended to be just short-term mixtures, 4, 5 years. Or if you're like me, you intend to plant them for 5 years and you like them so much that you leave them for 10 or 12 because it's just hard to kill them once you get them established. So, how long do you need to have them in there in order to get benefit? How long from this graph, and I got this from my introductory soils book that I had in college, how long did it take to get the organic matter back up to the original level? Almost 100 years, right? But where did most of the improvement come? The first few years, right? So instead of planting a small percentage of your land to perennial sods and leaving it for 100 years, you can get more benefit to your land by planting a sod and rotating it out and establishing another sod somewhere else, so that each of your land, each parcel of land is exposed to a sod sometime within your lifetime. Okay? Now, people have been writing about this concept for a long time. This from Exodus. I don't know if this is more of an advertisement for lay farming, or maybe this is for your milpa garden, Keith, Jimmy. The needy of your people may eat. 1/7 of your land. That part about the beasts of the field, though, that kind of applies towards lay farming. Because lay farming, not only are you putting that to perennial grasses, but you're also pasturing it. And I think some of our speakers, if you're not yet convinced of the need of having animal impact to restore soil, then probably you want to get online and watch the YouTube videos of some of our previous speakers, because it didn't sink in enough the first time. But I think having the livestock impact is absolutely essential. People have been writing about this for a long time. I mean, obviously 4,000 years ago, Moses wrote about it in Exodus. Pliny the Elder in ancient Rome wrote about this. But one of the first modern writers to speak about it was a guy named Robert Elliott. And he was in the UK, and he wrote a book called The Clifton Park System of Farming. You can find this book online in its entirety, and it's still very good reading. Now, one of the things that Robert Elliott really hammered on was not just planting grasses and legumes, but including a third component that we'll get to later, that he considered essential to the success of the system. Now, more recently, in Argentina, when Perón came to power in Argentina, I listened to a man from Argentina explain this. Basically, Perón was a true socialist, and he believed that the government should get everybody what they needed to live on. And, of course, that took massive taxes. Argentina has only one industry, and that's agriculture. So all the taxes, basically, to fund all the massive social welfare programs came from taxes levied on agriculture. All exports were taxed. All imports were taxed. All the exports were whatever farmers produced, and all the imports were whatever farmers bought. So effectively, the price of what they sold was dropped in half, and the price of what they bought was doubled. So we complain about high inputs and low prices. In Argentina, it was way worse. So in order to survive, the Argentinians developed this crop rotation where basically they had 5 years of an alfalfa-based pasture, alfalfa grass pasture. It was taken out after 5 years. It was pasture, not hayed. So all the manure, all the organic matter was deposited right back on the land. You could grow a corn crop for 1 year without needing fertilizer. Then you could grow beans, and then back to wheat, and then they'd reestablish the sod. And they could do those 3 crops in sequence with no herbicides, no insecticides, no fertilizer. Pretty sustainable system. And then the government found out a way of making money off this one too, and so it's kind of faded away. But, so this lay farming thing, what's it good for? What's in it for me? Why should I be interested in this lay farming thing? Well, this is one of my favorite sets of pictures. This is from Ray Weil, and it's actually 2 photographs there, and these were taken with a Rhizotron. Rhizotron is a little miniature camera, and they put it in a plexiglass tube and take pictures of roots. Where's all that feedback come from? I'm bumping it. Okay. I might have to move it here. The picture on the left was taken on the 3rd of May. That's a canola cover crop root. And the one to the right, they sprayed the canola out and planted soybeans in it no-till. The one on the right is a picture of the soybean root on the 8th of August. What do you see about that? Basically, it used it like a pilot hole, didn't it? Went right down the same root channel. Followed the path of least resistance. Now, how much deeper do you think that soybean root can go once it has this easy pathway? Okay. Now, canola root is a fairly deep-rooted plant, but it's an annual. So this is comparing, this is from the Land Institute, this is comparing wheatgrass to wheat. There's a little bit of difference in the root system between a perennial and an annual. And you notice that scale, 3 meters, that's about 13, 14 feet. That is a very deep-rooted plant. How much more water and nutrients will a following grain crop be able to access following a perennial cover crop versus an annual cover crop? Do roots have an impact on the soil? This is a riverbank, and I think you can just barely see, this is a tree trunk here, right here. This is the root system of that tree. Is that root system having any effect on that underlying soil? Pretty dramatic change in the characteristics of that soil. Roots do change soil. Does that have an impact on drought tolerance of your following crops? Any of this, has anybody seen any of this in recent years? Droughted out corn? Anybody remember? Anybody around here in 2011, 2012? Hey, perennial crops are probably the best crops you can have for controlling erosion. Well, who was saying, was it Willie? Were you saying about we've got 60 years left? Richard was saying that? Yeah, the UN says we've got 60 years worth of farming before our soil is ruined at current rates. We have to do something about erosion, because our lives depend on it. Maybe not our lives, but the lives of our children and grandchildren certainly do. And perennial sods are the absolute best way of handling it. You can also use perennial sods. One of the beauties of the Argentinian crop rotation was that you could build up a big pool of organic nitrogen that could sustain a following grain crop without the need of nitrogen fertilizer. Since nitrogen fertilizer is manufactured by and large from natural gas, which is a finite resource, at some point we're going to have to learn how to do this over again. Oops, sorry. Resistant weeds. I first started fighting glyphosate-resistant Palmer amaranth in 2008. I had a soybean field, and this would have made that soybean field look like a manicured lawn. It was pretty ugly. Instead of whipping out more and more chemicals, I decided I'm just going to put this field to a sod. And when you decide to use Palmer amaranth as a grazing plant, instead of treating it like a competitor, it goes from being your worst enemy to your best friend, because it is a fantastic forage. Extremely high in protein, very nutritious, very palatable, and extremely water efficient. If it were not for Palmer amaranth, I would have gone belly up ranching in 2012, because that was the only thing that grew on my place. And I actually had my best cattle performance ever in 2012 because of Palmer amaranth. Unfortunately, all for good or for bad, when you put in a sod crop, Palmer amaranth disappears. It just goes away. And I can't find it in those fields anymore. I almost wish I had a little bit of it, because it really is pretty good late summer pasture. But it's a great way of managing resistant weeds. Diseases in crops, things like sudden death syndrome. This is starting to become epidemic all over the Corn Belt. almost all crop diseases will fade away in the absence of a host. Any soil-borne or residue-borne diseases just go away when you insert a sod crop into the rotation. Nematodes. Nematodes tend to go away as well. Now you can get different kinds of nematodes in the sod that will build up over time, but those nematodes tend to not affect your cash crops that are going to follow. Now, has this, that's not the slide I put in here. Has this been researched? Is whenever I throw out an idea that's kind of left-wing like this, well, where's the research on it? There is not a lot. Why hasn't it? Now, Richard was talking about why adaptive management grazing practices haven't been researched a lot. A lot of the same reasons why lay farming has not been researched a lot. Well, one thing is the average tenure of a grad student is about 2 or 3 years. Can you do research on lay farming in 2 or 3 years? Really takes about 12. If you got a 5 or 6 year sod and then you have to track the follow-up crops after that and go through several cycles of that, this is a very long-term research project, and grad students don't want to stick around that long. Another thing is, if you incorporate livestock grazing as a treatment, you need broad expanses, which means you need a lot of land, which means you need a lot of money. This is not something that is easy to research in small plots, because livestock grazing does not lend itself to small plot research. It takes broad expanses. So, and the other thing is, a lot of the funding that we get in our land grant universities comes from agribusiness. What agribusiness is going to fund research on a system of farming that eliminates the need for their inputs? It's just not going to happen. So a lot of the original research done on lay farming is from 150 years old. There's very little research on this practice. But here is one from the University of Florida, and I would say this is really not true lay farming, and I'll explain why here in a bit. But you look at this, continuous peanut with no fungicide, 1,600 pounds. You add fungicide in, and you can double the yield. And you add nematicide in, you're creeping up there, using a lot of expensive inputs to prop up a very poor cropping system. That's what we've done over a lot of our country. We've used expensive inputs to prop up poor farming systems. Now you rotate a little bit with cotton. I'm not sure that this is any more sustainable than what the continuous peanut is, but it is a little better at promoting yield. But look what happened when they put a 2-year Bahia grass pasture in. Just a 2-year pasture sod. Look what happened to the yield of the peanuts. And more importantly, the profit. The profit per acre, and they did an economic analysis on this, and it only took 250 acres to raise a family on that bottom rotation. What does that do for your social structure? One of the videos, the White Oak Farms video about the rural sociology, what happens when you put a farm family on every 250 acres instead of every 2,700 acres? What impact does that have on rural communities? And the income was more stable year to year. I think that's also important too. So, if this is such a wonderful thing, why isn't everybody lay farming? Why isn't everybody doing this? Well, there are 2 myths of establishing grass. One is that it takes 3 years to establish grass. You're only leaving this in for 5 years, right? So you spend 5 years, 3 years getting it established, and you only get 2 years of good out of it before you kill it and you're back to crops. Here's the other one. Grazing native grass, or grass in general, is non-productive and unprofitable because everybody knows you make more money on crops than you do on pasture. That's why we've had, I don't know how many big historic plow downs we've had over the course of this country, but from 2008 to 2013, we had one of the biggest ones in the history of this country. There was a lot of acres of grass that went to crops in that time period. So let's just examine these two myths. Now, Wayne Gretzky said something as one of my favorite quotes. Someone asked him the secret of his success. He said, "It's really simple. Everybody else skates to where the puck is. I skate to where the puck's going to be." You can look at CRP, say, yeah, that took 3 years to get established. You can look at our current native grass pastures and say, yeah, that's not a very profitable acre compared to that acre over there in crops. So why do we have these perceptions? But instead of Wayne Gretzky looking at the way things are, let's think about the way things could be or should be. Why does it take native grass so long to get established? One of the main reasons is because we don't inoculate with mycorrhizal fungi. We're putting in only one component of that ecosystem. That's the plants. What we have omitted from virtually all plantings in history has been the fungal component that is so necessary for the establishment of some of these grasses. This is the mycorrhizal fungi here. This is a root hair, and this is the hyphae of the mycorrhizal fungi. And you can see all the surface area. This can extend about 18 inches beyond that root zone and access water and nutrients up to 1,000 times better than bare roots alone. Obviously, that's big, especially for a seedling plant. Now, when I was with, Keith mentioned that I worked for Valent. When I worked for Valent, I worked in their mycorrhizal fungi division. It was really interesting. I learned a lot, had some neat experiences. One time when I was on a plane trip home from corporate headquarters, there's this extremely attractive woman who's in the airline seat next to me, and she struck up a conversation with me, and I remember that distinctly because that doesn't happen very often to me. And so, we were talking, what do you do? And I asked her what she did, and she said she trains people how to use payroll software, and she was flying to do a training session on how to use payroll accounting software. She asked me what I did, and I said, well, I work with this fungus that makes plants grow better. Oh, really? Tell me about that. So here was this woman from the city just fascinated with this fungus that makes plants grow better. Why isn't everybody using this? I wish I knew, because I'd really like to sell a lot of it. And, well, when the plane landed, we parted ways, and so I holler at her, said, oh, good luck with your presentation. She hollers back, hey, good luck with your fungus. And at that point, people started moving away from me and said, I sit next to that guy. So they ran over to the little, hand sanitizer. So. But anyhow, amazing organism, and it is absolutely critical for the establishment of most, if not all, of our warm season perennials, and some of our cool season perennials as well. And this just illustrates kind of how important that is. This is from the Journal of Range Management, 14-week biomass, which in my area, that is basically the growing season on a warm season grass. No fertilizer, no mycorrhizal fungi, 0.187 grams per plant. You add fertilizer, or you add the mycorrhizal, boy, that bumps it up. You can fertilize it, and it bumps it up, but not as much as the mycorrhizal. Look what happens when you add both. Is that a little different? That's what, 30 times the biomass? That's pretty significant. Do you see why it has taken us so long to get grass established in the past? We did not use this type of program. Now, native grass is unproductive. Why is this native grass unproductive? Can you tell why this native grass is unproductive? What would be the limiting factor if you tried to grow corn on this acre? Why are our native grass pastures still a native grass? Because they couldn't grow crops. Anything that could be plowed was plowed. The only thing that spared the plow was the ground that was too dang poor to grow anything else. So we have this perception of grass productivity on the worst soil compared to crops on the best soil. What kind of pasture can you grow on the best soil? Okay. David Hula, I want you to think about something. David Hula set the world corn record yield in 2015, 532 bushel an acre. When does corn canopy? About the 1st of June? And it black layers about September 1st. That 532 bushel an acre was basically 3 months of full photosynthesis. How many months out of the year can you get a pasture to photosynthesize? Basically, any month the temperature is above freezing, right? How much more production potential is there in a pasture that receives the same level of management as David Hula's corn? How many people are managing pasture the same intensity that the average corn farmer manages corn? Now here's the neat difference. When you say managing corn intensely, what are you talking about? A lot of fertilizer, insecticides, fungicides, herbicides, a lot of inputs. When you manage pasture intensely, what are we talking about? Any of those? We're just talking about management, not inputs, but management. So my theory is that you can make more money off pasture and be more productive off pasture because it is a more efficient vehicle at harvesting sunlight than corn. And we talked about we're in the business of harvesting sunlight and converting it into something useful. A perennial plant can do that better than an annual because it doesn't have to start from scratch each and every year. You cannot compare this native grass productivity to the productivity that you could achieve on true native grass. The other thing is native grass typically has not received any fertility input. Look what happens when, this is from University of Nebraska, when you get some nitrogen input combined with some burning. Now, you say, well, wait a minute, Dale, you were talking earlier, we can do this without inputs. Now you're talking about inputs. Is there a way to get nitrogen in a pasture other than fertilizer? Absolutely. Absolutely. And we'll talk about that. Another thing is that we are comparing wild genetics On corn, does anybody plant bin run corn? Well, I do, but just for pasture. Does anybody in raising grain corn still plant bin run corn? And why not? Because there's much better genetics available. This is an Indian grass plot. Brett and I took this down in Arkansas, Dale Bumpers Research Center. Are there differences in those genetics? This is Indian grass. Is one of those maybe a little better than the others? Which one would you guys plant? One on the right. Isn't that dramatic? Now, here's the other thing. All of these are selected top-of-the-line varieties of Indian grass. This wasn't something someone dug up or collected from a road ditch. Well, I guess at one time they probably were. But these are the best of the best. That one at the right is called Americus. You can tell it's pretty superior to the other ones. How much superior is it to just what's out at random? You plant superior genetics of some of this stuff, how much more can you get off that acre? Now, how much are you willing to spend on top flight genetics on grass or forage crops? Probably a lot of it depends on how long are you going to keep that stand in. If you're going to keep it in forever, you might want the absolute best genetics. If you're only going to keep it in 4 or 5 years, you might want to scrimp a little bit. Go with something a little cheaper. Warm season grasses versus cool season grasses. Another consideration of establishing the sod. Which do you put in? Well, let's talk about advantages and disadvantages, and I'll talk about the warm season grasses compared to the cool season grasses. Warm season grasses have a higher rate of photosynthesis, about 3 times as high per day. Have bigger root mass. They're more water efficient, and they're more heat tolerant. And you say, woohoo, I'm going to plant all warm season grasses. But wait, not so fast, my friend. They also have a shorter growing season. And they have lower forage quality at similar stages of maturity. So which of these do you plant? Both? Okay, now you're thinking along the same lines. There's advantages to each, obviously. And it depends a little bit on what your operation is. If you are a cow-calf and you are in this area, which do you already have? Okay, around here, but primarily, if you're surrounded by Bermuda grass, you've already got warm season grass. You might want to go with cool season grasses. If you're in northeast Oklahoma, you might be surrounded by fescue, and you might want to go with warm season grasses. And then someone says, can we plant them together? I was always taught, and my experience has always been that warm season grasses and cool season grasses do not coexist. One eventually chokes out the other. And for most of my life, I have had that prejudice. You plant them in separate pastures because they require different management. I'm starting to change my mind a little on that because if more and more people are using adaptive grazing, they tend to strike a balance. And I think maybe going forward, we will be planting warm and cool season grasses in blends with each other to extend the grazing system. Now there's some other tricks you can use to strike that balance, extend that grazing season. One of the things, I didn't include the pictures in here, but one thing that we're doing in my area is in our warm season grass pastures, we are overseeding with cool season annuals. Cool season legumes, cereals, annual ryegrass. Now I know in Bermuda grass country, that's a common practice. In native grass country, that's pretty revolutionary. The other thing we're doing is on our cool season grass pastures, we're interseeding warm season annuals, Sudan grass, corn, soybeans, cowpeas, sun hemp, stockpiling that all throughout the summer and grazing it in the fall, along with our cool season grass regrowth. That has been phenomenal, because usually on our cool season grass regrowth in September, we've got about this much growth, starting from this table, not from there. About 6-8 inches of growth. When we have the summer annuals in that cool season grass, we'll get 6 to 8 feet of growth available for fall grazing. What's the toughest time of year to provide grazing around here? September, October? Yeah. When you have that cool season grass with the summer annuals seeded into it, we can accumulate a tremendous amount of biomass on that. And to me, that's one of the more exciting things out there. Now, some of the things I've shown you have been pure grasses. Research does not like polycultures. Adds a lot of variability. Actual practice likes polycultures. Now, this is a grass legume mix, but better yet is a grass legume and forb mix. And forbs have been very rarely planted until just recently. But Robert Elliott's book, Newman Turner's book, all those guys in the UK that talked about herbal lay pastures considered the forbs to be the most important component of all the species in the pasture. This is chicory, and part of the value of these forbs has been they have extremely deep roots and they have an extremely high mineral content. They also contain secondary compounds. I believe as Willie was talking about the secondary compounds protecting the plants from insects and diseases, those same secondary compounds in the forbs protect the grazing animals from diseases and from mineral deficiencies. And this is, you look at this, here's forb. Notice where the forb roots are? They are below the level of the grasses. They can access minerals and water that the grasses alone cannot. Some of these things will go deeper than alfalfa roots. And another neat phenomenon is during the daytime, you have transpirational pull. The atmosphere is pulling water out of the plant, so water moves up in the plant. Then at night, when the air hits the dew point, that water goes rushing back out of the tops and unloads right here below the soil surface. You get a water pump effect. Those forbs will actually irrigate their neighbors. And this has been documented with chicory. And I'm sure it also happens with a number of these other deep-rooted forbs. Another neat one is plantain. Plantain is a really unique plant. This is a plant native to Europe, but it contains some really strong antimicrobial compounds. In fact, they have found that the urine from cattle acts as can be used as an antibiotic 36 hours after, for a period of 36 hours after consumption of plantain. Now, one other benefit of this, beyond health benefits, is that weak antimicrobial nature of plantain behaves in the rumen just like an ionophore. It kills off the archaic bacteria that produce methane, which means not only does it reduce methane emissions, but methane production is really inefficient in the rumen. You eliminate methane production, you improve feed efficiency and animal performance. So you can get an ionophore effect from a plant instead of from a pharmaceutical company. Some other neat ones. This is cup plant. You can see I'm not very tall, but that plant's a lot taller than me. This plant is native to the prairie here in the United States. Been virtually no research done on it in this country, but in Uruguay they have researched this, and it has increased their pasture production, animal production off pasture on dairy cows by about 150% compared to regular grass. Pretty exciting. Now, how's this look for productivity? This is another native, sawtooth sunflower. We had to stretch that camera lens out a little bit to get that all in. And you think, how would cattle graze that? Well, they tend to straddle it, walk it down, and then strip the leaves off, and then it goes fruit, bouncing back up after they're through. It's kind of fun to watch. Now, the other thing about establishing grasses is, what if that establishment year is not an economic loss? This is a switchgrass field during the year of establishment. What do you see with it? Corn. Switchgrass is tolerant of atrazine, 2,4-D, dicamba, a lot of your weed control products that can be, used in corn. This is one of our customers, and this is what this is what it looked like the next year. That basically looks like Doug Peterson's four-wheeler, although you can't see it. You can see the stack of ring top post there on the four-wheeler. That is a second-year stand of switchgrass in full production prior to first grazing. That didn't take 3 years to establish. And he got a corn crop off in the seeding year. Now, here's better yet. What do you think of this grass? That's actually 30 days after the first grazing. This Eastern Gamma grass. This is the single best soil improving grass that I know of. This stuff is amazing. It's got an air conducting tissue in its roots called a parenchyma that allows it to penetrate root penetrating layers. It also has the highest rate of photosynthesis of any terrestrial plant recorded. It is related to corn. And the productivity, the wildlife value of this plant, and the nutritional value of it, this is my #1 favorite warm season grass to plant. It is as productive as Bermuda grass with far better wildlife value and far better nutritional value. And this is 30 days post-grazing. One other attribute of Eastern Gamma grass is that it is the single most shade tolerant, this is from the University of Missouri, most shade tolerant warm season perennial grass, which means that it is a perfect candidate. Look at it compared to the switchgrass. Way down here. There's a switchgrass. If you think switchgrass established well under that corn, here's my gamma grass during the establishment year. And I probably made a mistake turning cattle in during the establishment year, let them graze that corn off, but I really didn't want to combine the corn. And I was either going to have to move cows or open the gate. I'm pretty lazy, so I chose to open the gate, as that was the only source of feed I had where they're at, but it didn't seem to hurt it. Here's the next year. And of course, Eastern Gamma grass is a bunch grass. All kinds of room in between these clumps. #1, for upland game birds to run around in, and to insert other plants like alfalfa. I've got red clover. I've got some sandfoin in there. I've got some Cicer milk vetch. I've got some trefoil. I've got some chicory. I've got some plantain. I've got a whole menagerie of plants in there. Now, here's the best part about this, though. This little marker is 18 inches of depth. And this is what my subsoil looked like below that 18 inches depth. This is where the clay layer starts. How would you describe this layer here? Clay. Looks like gray Play-Doh, doesn't it? Like modeling clay? That's pretty accurate description. Now, I have some bags here. I'll set this down just a second. I have the topsoil for my, and I'm surrounded by, everybody likes to make fun of their neighbors. My neighbors are all excellent farmers. They're way better farmers than I am. But we do farm differently. My neighbor is an excellent long-term no-till corn soybean farmer. As far as corn soybean rotation, he does as good a job as anybody I could point to. But I've got some of his topsoil. I also dug down about 6 inches and took some of the second layer in that soil. The other bags are of my soil, both my topsoil, and then I went down 24 inches. Now, my original intent was to get a sample from 24 inches down my neighbor's field, and then it was about 6 in the morning. Keith was coming to pick me up to head down here, and it was dark because I didn't want to steal my neighbor's soil in the daytime, Because then you have to explain, yeah, I'm using you as a bad example. So I do such things in the middle of the night. And I could only dig down a little ways, and that's as far as I could get. That spade just stopped. And 6 inches down was as far as I could physically dig into that soil. And so you can take those out, compare, contrast them. I would have liked to have had his 24 inches versus my 24 inches, but what you got is my 24 inches versus his 6 inches there. And then just a hand grab sample of the topsoil on each one. And in the meantime, while those bags are circulating around, okay, this is before gamma grass and mycorrhizal fungi. Oops. This is that fall. Applied it in the spring of 2014. And you can see that there is some streaks, some dark streaks starting to form through there. I'm holding a clod from a control area of the same depth, and you can see that there is a darkening, and you can also see some soil structure starting to form there. It's gone from a massive Play-Doh looking structure to starting to get some kind of blocks in there. And this is what it looks like now. And you see that white pointer is at the 18-inch depth that it was at, the arrow was at in 2013. So, bottom line on this is that you can make a pretty dramatic improvement in your soil in just a few years. And it does not take an economic sacrifice to do so. You can make money on this system while it's in pasture. In fact, everybody I've talked to, people say, well, what happens when you take that out for crops? You know what? Every single person I've talked into doing this has not decided to take it out and go to crops. I only know one person that's done that. And he hasn't harvested his corn yet because it's, amazingly enough, still green. He figured it would be his last corn harvested, but he was sure bragging about it this summer.